Hey YouTube. Today we'll be talking about the mind of a politician. To better understand how politicians act, we can look at ideas of famous philosophers who studied power, authority, and political behavior. These philosophers don't just talk about systems of government, but also explain the reasons behind politicians' actions. And we'll be discussing five philosophers whose ideas help explain how politicians behave along with some of their main points and counter arguments. For our first example, we have Niccolo Machiavelli. In his book, The Prince, Machiavelli says that the main goal of a leader is to gain and keep power. He believes that rulers may need to deceive, manipulate, or even act harshly to achieve this goal. The ideal ruler isn't necessarily bound by moral rules, but by what works best for maintaining power. How it applies to politicians is that Machiavelli's ideas explain why politicians sometimes use manipulation, create false images, or stir up crisis to gain support. For instance, they may use propaganda, political tricks, or even cause problems on purpose just to strengthen their power. For a counterpoint, critics would say that Machiavelli's advice is too ruthless and ignores the importance of moral leadership. In democratic societies, people expect leaders to be open and honest, so Machiavellian tactics may not always work. For our second example, we have Thomas Hobbes. And for Thomas Hobbes, he had a book called Leviathan, and he argued that humans are naturally selfish, and without strong rules, society would fall into chaos and collapse. To avoid this, people ought to create a government that has the power to keep order, even if it means using force or control to maintain some level of society decency. How it applies to politicians is that politicians sometimes use Hobbes's idea to justify strong or even harsh action during a crisis. They may argue that strict laws or emergency powers are needed to protect citizens from danger and to maintain order. However, critics would argue that Hobbes's overestimation of the need for force and ignoring the ability of the people to work together peacefully is the argument in and of itself. In democratic systems, people who value individual freedoms, would clash with Hobbes's emphasis on control. For our third example, we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had this idea known as the social contract. Rousseau believes that government should be based on general will of the people, meaning decisions should reflect or ought to reflect what is best for everyone. He also thinks that people are naturally good, but that society can make them selfish and corrupt. Politicians often claim they represent the will of the people, especially when they push for policies that seem to help everyone. Rousseau's idea of quote-unquote forced freedom can explain why politicians would maybe sometimes create laws that limit individual freedoms, but say it's for the quote-unquote common good. Some critics, though, would say that the general will argument is a little too vague, and it can be misused by politicians to maybe justify oppressive laws or systems or policies. They worry that leaders could claim to act for the public good while taking away people's freedom slowly and over time. For our fourth example, we have Karl Marx. Marx believed that political power is shaped by the needs of the rich, especially in capitalist societies. He argued that the government often serves the interests of the wealthy, protecting their property and keeping the working class in a lower position, or sort of a level on a pyramid. Marx's ideas kind of help explain why politicians sometimes make decisions that favor the rich, like lowering taxes for the wealthy or resisting changes that would help the poor or the middle class. Politicians may support capitalism because it ultimately benefits the rich, who controls much of the power in a capitalist society. As a counterpoint, critics would argue that Marx's view of society is too simple, and it doesn't really account for other factors that influence politics, like elections, like ideology, or concern for social welfare. Also, capitalism hasn't always collapsed as Marx predicted, so there's still room for error in that regard. For our fifth example, we have Michel Foucault. Foucault studied how power works in a society and showing that it's not just about rulers themselves who are forcing people to obey, much like the Machiavellian, or maybe in some would argue the Hobbesian sense, but it's also about sort of shaping what is considered normal. Foucault argues that power operates through everyday institutions like schools, like hospitals, and maybe even the media to some extent. Foucault's idea explained how politicians use things like the media and law enforcement to change or influence public opinion and contain and control behavior. He shows how power can be subtle and it can influence people's lives even without obvious force, like maybe through surveillance or social rules. However, as a counterpoint, critics would say that Foucault focuses too much on the hidden ways power works and doesn't pay attention maybe to the traditional government structures or even the ability of people themselves to resist these sometimes subtle power changes and influences. His ideas can make it seem like individuals have no control or have no power to manage their own reality effectively, which can be a little discouraging for those who believe in a democratic participation, even if you'll want to look through this lens, maybe through Rousseau, of the general will that the people ultimately have the power. So I think in conclusion, to wrap this up neatly, I think we can say that all these philosophers, whether it's Machiavelli, Hobbes, Rousseau, Marx, or Foucault, they all offer a different way of thinking about why politicians act the way they do. Machiavelli explains the power-hungry side of politics. Hobbes justifies control for safety. Rousseau highlights the role of people's will. Marx focuses on class and capitalism and the constant struggle between those two forces and ideas. And Foucault shows how power is exercised in everyday life. But each philosopher provides important insights, but their ideas also have limits that need to be explored and considered in the real world of politics. So I hope this was a helpful short video that can help sort of summarize and explain the different types of ways that politicians maneuver and walk through the public space. And maybe you can apply some of these ideas to even incidences that are happening in today's time, whether that's here in the United States or anywhere else in the world. But if you like what you see, feel free to like and subscribe. Your support means a ton. And thank you for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day.